So a couple months ago, we posted a video looking at some of the most iconic watches under $1,000. In the comment section of that video, you all were giving us some good encouragement to want to continue this series. So that's what we're doing here, extending up from $1,000 to $2,000, looking at some iconic watches that you can buy new now today. So just to establish ourselves here, what is an icon? Let's start with the definition and look at some of the criteria I am thinking about when putting together a list like this. First, with a definition for an icon, a person or thing regarded as a representative symbol or as worthy of veneration. Some other points of criteria that were crossing my mind when putting together a list like this. One, are these watches historically impactful? Even if that is more recent history, it still can be included on this list. It's all about that impact that it made. For its design, is it legendary? Did it help establish characteristics going forward for a genre specifically? Further, was it influential both to collectors, the industry, and pop culture? And just to be clear, this is not talking about vintage examples that you can get from $1,000 to $2,000. We're talking about new watches that come from a line and lineage of watches that might be iconic from the past that are still available today. So let's kick it off with two watches from the same brand. I'm gonna start with one and then we'll shift into another, starting with the Seiko Prospex SPB143. When these were released in 2020, I think they were met with some mixed feelings from collectors. One, these were watches above $1,000 from Seiko, but then once you started to try these on and more people got hands-on with them, we started to see a shift in how people were looking at these watches. If you've ever tried these on, they're absolutely phenomenal, but we start to look at why this watch made an impact for those that are in the know for Seiko's dive watch history. Back in 1965, Seiko released a watch that was crucial to both their history and then the history of Japanese dive watches, being the first professional Japanese dive watch ever released, the 62 Mas. This watch created much of the DNA where all other Seiko dive watches pull from in some way or another. It also kicked off one of the most important nations in their chase for the top, or maybe the bottom when you're talking about the depth of creating dive watches that were some of the best in the world. It follows a skin diver design and format, refined compared to other Prospex models, but this serves as what Seiko calls their reinterpretation of that 1965 62 Mas. In its look and feel, it matches many of the traditional characteristics. For looking at the modern version, you have a 40.5mm case, 13.2 millimeters in thickness, 47.6 millimeters lug to lug, so very wearable across the wrist, wearing like a 39.5 to 40 millimeter ISO compliant dive watch, 200 meters of water resistance, fantastic lume, and the 6R35 on the inside. And before we get too far into this video, guys, we just launched a new watch on TeddyBaldaStar.com at a new case size at 39 millimeters, a dive watch from Mido, the Ocean Star 39 millimeter. So this watch takes a new case diameter for the Mido Ocean Star collection, fitting into that mid-size range that I think so many people have been asking for across the industry. Now Mido answering the call with a watch that's just in that $1,000 price point, providing great value across the board. You have a wave style pattern dial, which is unbelievable to look at different angles, creates this texture and unique flair. You have 4 different versions to choose from. The blue to black gradient version is probably my personal favorite. Very entrancing to look at. Wearability across the board is going to be appealing for those that are from the Tudor Black Bay 58 crowd or want something that wears similar to that, all while delivering an 80-hour power reserve movement. This is the C07.611 on the inside. This is coming from a brand that I would argue presents some of the best value for entry-level Swiss dive watches. If you're interested in this collection, check it out in the description down below where you can shop and learn a little bit more. So now we shift to another dive watch from Seiko, mostly at the 1970s now, the early 1970s, looking at the Seiko Willard. So these watches and the watches we're gonna be looking at now in terms of references, you have the SPB153, but also the SPB183 as representations of this case shape. These watches descend from the 6105 worn by Martin Sheen in Apocalypse Now, while further cementing itself as a formative case silhouette to inform other Seiko divers in the years to come. These watches are some of the most collectible vintage dive watches from Seiko, and also creating many of the visual cues that we would now associate while having some more distinct points of example of being their own and separating from other Seiko dive watches. For a couple of things to call out, their square rectangular markers, the cushion style case, which isn't necessarily anything new, but it has a little bit of its own flair, its distinct secondhand indication to go along with it, and all the lore that comes with being featured in a movie. These watches were much smaller than their proposed diameter at 42.7 millimeters for that diameter, thickness of 13.7 millimeters, and a lug-to-lug of 46 millimeters with 200 meters of water resistance. This next watch is very near and dear to my heart and was one of the reasons that I got into watch collecting in the first place. It was the design that I saw and it resonated immediately. The watch, the Junghans Max Bill. So let's set the stage for why this watch is important. Back in the 1950s, Junghans connected with Swiss designer Max Bill. Max Bill was a student at the Bauhaus School of Design when it was in operation in the earlier part of the 20th century and was crucial in the development of the Bauhaus movement of design that became pervasive during this era and years beyond. When Junghans and Max Bill engaged with one another in the 1950s, the first ask was creating a wall clock, and the creation that came thereafter was a kitchen wall clock timer with many of the same cues that you might notice with the eventual wristwatch that would come later, but also featuring a timer at the lower portion of the clock. Shortly thereafter, the next ask was to create a wristwatch. Reportedly, this was a massive point of interest for Max Bill, who had a fondness for pocket watches as well as wristwatches, so he jumped on the task. The design that came from it was the Max Bill from Junghans. It represents a foundational point for Bauhaus in watchmaking, while also intersecting the mastery of industrial design. If you ever frequent a museum of modern art, you might be able to find one of these watches for sale in there, but this was also a watch for me that, when looking at it, creates so many of the elements of watchmaking that I love. It's not excessive, it's thoughtful about its design and use of space. The typography and text on display is absolutely sublime and so its own. And its case silhouette that is more bulbous on the side profile, but also with its curvature of the dial and curved crystal, pops out off the wrist as if it looks like a wall clock, which makes sense and fitting considering the origins. I'm wearing on my wrist right now a Max Bill chronoscope, which was very crucial in the development of my own affinity to this style and design. The watch can be found with a hand winding model, but probably the epitome of what Max Bill brought forth was going to be the standard Max Bill automatic no date version at 38 millimeters, slim thickness at 9.8 millimeters, despite having that dome sapphire crystal now in these instances, automatic caliber on the inside, and there's essentially no bezel on these watches. It is all dial, but that is part of the fun and why these watches are unlike anything else. So I struggled with trying to really expand out this list from $1,000 to $2,000, and I might forget a few watches here, but one that was springing to mind, and it might not be the first that comes to your mind, but I think you can make a case for it, is the Rado DiaStar. Back in 1962, Rado released the Captain Cook as well as another release, known as the DiaStar. Its radical looks was probably enough to make an imprint on the memory of watchmaking in the public at large. But what really allowed it to etch its way into the history books for watchmaking was its ability to resist scratches and being positioned as one of the first scratch-proof watches, those are Rado's words, as it used two different approaches at the time that were seldom seen. One, the additional hardness of the case that could resist scratches, but also utilizing a sapphire crystal in a period that was dominated by the use of acrylic crystals. The DiaStar also is a watch that becomes this formative reaching piece for different cultures around the globe. In many parts of Pakistan as well as India, this is the watch that you purchase when you make it. The modern Rado DiaStar original comes with a Ceramos case that is going to have this high reflection, but despite that high reflection and what looks to be high polish, which it is, but it's made of Ceramos. This is a material that has a scratch resistance rating and a hardness rating, I should say, of 1400 Vickers. For context, stainless steel, around 150 to 200 untreated. The case is unlike anything else, 38 millimeters in diameter, 12.1 millimeters in thickness, very wearable lug to lug. There's almost no lugs that you can see when looking at this watch straight on, but lug to lug 45 millimeters, water resistance of 100 meters, and of course, like the 1962 version, a sapphire crystal. Now we shift into dive watch design, and a watch and a brand that needs to be mentioned here is Doxa with their sub 300 family and their 300T. The modern Doxa sub 300 and 300T will have different price and positioning depending on the COSC certified movement on the inside. To get into a Doxa sub 300 under this price, you have to look at the sub 300T, but given that it is under $2,000, I thought it made sense to talk about the collection more broadly. So back in the late 1960s, Doxa unveiled the sub 300 and the sub 300T. They were two watches that were paramount to the broader development of dive watch design. To call out a few things that they brought forward, one was being an early adopter of cushion style cases in dive watches, something that we probably take for granted today since you see it all the time. This was a way to withstand different knocks, especially at the crown. Further, the choice of the orange professional dial, the professional being classified as the orange, that is its name. This was chosen with testing in mind, and it was not just an accident and a thought of color and having a fun approach with their dive watch. This was all down to the business and the details. Doxa tested out many different dial colors, and one reigned supreme when it came to its legibility, and that was the orange professional dial, proving to be the most effective when reading in these murky environments. Further, Doxa was a brand that delivered on key contributions to the world of diving beyond just the Doxa sub. Their watches often had a no decompression limits bezel, which were needed in this time. They were also one of the early pioneers of helium escape valves, being among the first in the industry to have a solution for trapped helium molecules in cases. And to top it all off, they had their watches used by US Navy divers in their Sea Lab trials, were also used by French Navy divers, and being some watches of choice by Jacques Cousteau and his team of underwater explorers. So I was going back and forth on whether or not to include this watch, but as someone who spent a lot of time learning about watchmaking in Glashütte, I'm a huge fan of German watchmaking, and the city of Glashütte has connected with me quite a bit as being this industrial powerhouse, but being such a sleepy little town, and you would never expect it. But the resilience of this area is something that is almost unprecedented in watchmaking, and it makes me even have more interest in the subject of this area. But I wanted to look at one brand specifically that falls in this price range that also calls home to this city, and that is Nomos. If you look at the broader history of watchmaking in Glashütte, you look back to 1845 with Ferdinand Adolf Lange. But as the story goes, there were some ups and downs in the history of watchmaking in this region. After World War II, there was a single government-permitted consolidated horological company known as the GUB, which brought together many of the resources and capabilities of brands from Glashütte. This remained and persisted for several decades until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, marking a new beginning of watchmaking for Glashütte. Part of this new beginning was in 1990 with the formation of a brand known as Nomos. Nomos is an independent brand and started back in 1990, producing watches shortly thereafter. If you look at the key pillars from Nomos in this era of the 1990s, you can mention a few different watches, but one that springs to mind first, and also being usually the vehicle in which they celebrate a lot of this classic watchmaking from Glashütte, is their Tangente. When we look at what resurrected the watchmaking in Glashütte, there's a lot of places that you can look. Many people give the props to Lange and how influential they were, but another brand we have to give praise to is Nomos. And the Tangente is, I would say, one of the representations of this rebirth, of one of the proudest areas in the entire globe for watchmaking. Nomos watches are the most in-house made watches at their price, and one of the most remarkable points of value in the entire industry. Many people get caught up in their designs, and yes, Nomos is a design-forward brand. Not going to speak to everybody, but they have their own approach and taste on things. But what's lost on many people is Nomos is an in-house manufacturer. They produce all of their own movements in-house, including the components for those movements in-house. If you go up into their higher-end collection, you're going to find that even they're using their own escapements that are produced in-house. Without Nomos and without the Tangente, German watchmaking in Glashütte, the center of German watchmaking, would not be what it is today. In the previous video looking at iconic watches under $1,000, I mentioned Laco as one of the big five that were producing watches for the German Air Force during World War II Flieger watch designs. Now at $1,000 to $2,000, we can enter another brand into the equation with Stowa as well as Laco, with their next tier up of Flieger style designs. So if you're not familiar with this history of watchmaking, similar to what we mentioned in the previous video, Laco and Stowa are among the original big five, along with Lange, IWC, and Vempi during World War II in producing Flieger watches for the German Air Force. These are the most entry-level watches that you're going to find of this genre from the big five, outside of other Laco products that are going to feature Miyota calibers. In both of these instances, you have Type A and Type B style dials to choose from, heavily focused on legibility and upholding many of the principles that were developed years ago. Both of these brands and this design concept have gone on to influence Pilot watches for decades to come, both producing their watches in Germany to this day. And now for our final watch on this list. This is another dive watch. We have a few different dive watches that we've talked about on this video, but I think dive watches are some of the most celebrated in all the industry. And if you're going to talk about dive watches in history, you cannot go long before mentioning the Zodiac Seawolf. Now, I have recently seen some contesting of when was the original year of founding for the Seawolf. For many years, 1953, but I also have seen some good counterpoints to show that it may have not actually happened in 1953, and it was actually later in the 1950s. But not getting into this debate further, I think we can all agree that the Zodiac Seawolf was one of the most important dive watches of the 1950s in the mid 20th century. Nowadays, you actually can still find some decent examples of Zodiac Seawolves in this price range of $1,000 to $2,000, although it is getting harder than it was in years past. If you're not feeling like going on a hunt and taking a chance, the easier thing to do is go for a new Seawolf. Now, the modern Zodiac company is operated by the Fossil Group, so completely different ownership. And if I had to pinpoint one watch from the brand that probably best represents some of the classic 1950s design and 1960s design, it'd be the Seawolf skin versions. Now, these are 39 millimeters, so a little bit larger than the Seawolf 53 cases that you will also see, 12.7 millimeters in thickness, lug to lug of 46.5 millimeters, water resistance of 200 meters. You have the STP movements on the inside and a sapphire crystal for these versions, with many different options of dial colors across the board for the Seawolf family, a theme that is pretty on point with the history of the design of these pieces. So there you have it, guys, some iconic watches from $1,000 to $2,000. I believe I could have missed something here. It is a little bit harder in this price range to pinpoint new watches that are still available from watches from the past that were iconic or what you can classify as iconic. So if I missed something, leave a comment down below and let me know. Further, if you want us to continue this to the next price point, let us know down in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, hit the bell icon, really do appreciate that. Also check out TeddyBaldister.com. TeddyBaldister.com is an authorized dealer of over 30 brands, quick and fast fulfillment, dedicated customer support, and a full factory warranty for all the products that we offer. In addition, how we're able to fund all of our productions here is through selling watches. So if you are in the market for a watch, we'd love to have your business. It allows us to keep doing what we're doing here, and we love what we do. But guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I will see you all very soon.